August 15th, 1971. Most people who study economics already know what happened on that date. President Richard Nixon walked into a television studio on a Sunday evening, looked straight into the camera, and quietly severed the link between the United States dollar and gold. Just like that. No vote. No warning. The announcement was made while markets were closed, so nobody could react until it was already done. He called it temporary. That was 55 years ago. The gold window never reopened. That story gets told a lot. If you follow this channel, you already know the details. The Bretton Woods system, the $35 peg, France demanding their gold back. Nixon's advisors huddled at Camp David for 3 days, hammering out a decision that would reshape the financial architecture of the entire planet. But here is something almost nobody talks about. On August 14th, 1971, exactly 1 day before Nixon's speech, a different kind of experiment began in a basement underneath Stanford University. A psychology professor named Philip Zimbardo recruited 24 young men, all college students, all screened for mental stability, all deemed perfectly normal. He flipped a coin, half became prisoners, half became guards. They were told the study would last 2 weeks. It lasted 6 days. In less than a week, the guards had become sadistic. They were stripping prisoners naked, forcing them to do push-ups for hours, spraying fire extinguishers at them through the bars, waking them at 2 a.m. with whistles and screaming. Prisoners stopped eating. One had a full emotional breakdown by the second day. Another started crying uncontrollably and had to be released. A third went on a hunger strike and got thrown into a pitch-dark closet they called the Hole. These were college kids, 20-year-old guys from middle-class families in California. Nobody with a criminal record, nobody with a history of violence. And within 72 hours, the ones wearing khaki uniforms and mirrored sunglasses were behaving like tyrants, and the ones wearing smocks with numbers stitched on them were falling apart psychologically. Now think about that timing. On one side of the country, a group of the most powerful men in America were meeting in secret at Camp David to hand themselves unlimited monetary authority. They were about to remove the only constraint on how much money the government could create. They were about to give themselves the financial equivalent of absolute power. On the other side of the country, in a Stanford basement, a group of ordinary people were being handed absolute power over other ordinary people. And within days, they had turned into something unrecognizable. One event broke our money. The other revealed something disturbing about what happens to human beings when you remove the rules. And I'm going to make the case to you today that these two events are not a coincidence. They are the same story told in 2 different languages. One is economics, the other is psychology, and both of them are about to become extremely relevant to what is happening right now in 2026, because the experiment that started in 1971 never actually ended. It just got bigger. To understand why the Stanford prison experiment matters beyond a psychology classroom, you need to understand exactly how it unraveled. Not the Hollywood version, the real sequence of events. Philip Zimbardo put out an ad in the local newspapers, Palo Alto Times, the Stanford Daily. It said, quote, "Male college students needed for a psychological study of prison life, $15 per day. That is about $120 a day in today's money." 75 people applied. Zimbardo and his team screened every single one with psychological evaluations and interviews to make sure they were selecting the most mentally stable, normal, average group of young men they could find. They narrowed it down to 24. Then Zimbardo did something clever. He made it real. On the morning of August 14th, actual Palo Alto police officers showed up at the homes of the students assigned to be prisoners. They arrested them in front of their neighbors, handcuffed them, read them their rights, drove them to the station in patrol cars, fingerprinted them. Then they were blindfolded and transported to the basement of Stanford's psychology building, which had been converted into a mock prison, bars on the doors, a hallway turned into something they called the yard, a supply closet turned into solitary confinement. The prisoners were stripped, deloused, and given smocks with identification numbers, no names, just numbers, stocking caps over their hair to simulate having their heads shaved, a chain locked around one ankle. From that moment on, they were no longer students. They were prisoner 8612, prisoner 1037. That was the identity they had. The guards got khaki uniforms, wooden batons, and mirrored sunglasses that hid their eyes. That detail matters. You could not see who they were behind those lenses. Their individual identity was gone too, just in a different direction. They were not people anymore. They were authority. Nobody told the guards to be cruel. Zimbardo gave them one instruction: maintain order. That was it. No physical violence. Just keep things running. And for about 12 hours, nothing particularly dramatic happened. Then the second morning arrived. The prisoners barricaded themselves inside their cells. They ripped off their ID numbers. They cursed at the guards. It was a rebellion, and it was the single most important moment in the entire experiment because of what happened next. The guards called in reinforcements. They grabbed fire extinguishers and blasted freezing carbon dioxide through the cell bars to force the prisoners back. Then they stripped them naked, confiscated their mattresses, and threw the ringleaders into the hole. But they did not stop there. They set up a privilege cell. The 3 prisoners who had been least involved in the rebellion got their beds back and a better meal. The point was not punishment, it was division. Turn the prisoners against each other, make them distrust each other, break the solidarity. And it worked. Within hours, the prisoners stopped cooperating with each other. Some started siding with the guards. Prisoner 8612 had a screaming breakdown that same night. He was sobbing, shaking, demanding to be let out. Zimbardo's team initially thought he was faking it to get released. He was not faking. Here is the part that should keep you up at night. None of this was scripted. The guards were not actors. They were not following a playbook. They invented these tactics on their own. Sleep deprivation, public humiliation, divide and conquer, isolation. These are not techniques you learn in a college dorm. These are techniques used by authoritarian regimes throughout history. And a handful of 20-year-old Californians came up with them independently, in under 48 hours, simply because they had been given unchecked power and a set of mirrored sunglasses. That is not a flaw in those specific individuals. That is a feature of the system. Give a normal person authority without accountability, and something inside them shifts. The role becomes the identity. The power becomes self-justifying. And the people under that power become something less than human in the eyes of the ones holding the baton. So now, hold that image in your mind. A group of regular people, no special training, no unusual psychology, given total authority over others with zero accountability, and in less than a week, they became unrecognizable. Now let me show you what was happening at the exact same time, 2,000 miles east of Stanford at Camp David. On August 13th, 1971, President Nixon quietly gathered 15 of his top advisors at the presidential retreat in Maryland. Federal Reserve Chairman Arthur Burns was there, Treasury Secretary John Connally was there, a young undersecretary named Paul Volcker was there, George Shultz, head of the Office of Management and Budget, was there. For 3 days, behind closed doors, they debated what to do about a system that was breaking. The Bretton Woods system had been in place since 1944. Every major currency in the world was pegged to the dollar, and the dollar was pegged to gold at $35 per ounce. Foreign governments could show up at the Treasury window and exchange their paper dollars for physical gold. That was the deal. That was the constraint. And constraints, as it turns out, matter. By 1971, the United States had been printing far more dollars than it had gold to back. The Vietnam War was bleeding money. Lyndon Johnson's Great Society programs were bleeding money. The Federal Reserve was pumping liquidity into the system to keep everything running. There were 4 times as many dollars in circulation as there was gold in the vaults. Countries started noticing. France was already demanding gold in exchange for their dollar reserves. Britain was about to do the same. The United States was hemorrhaging gold. There were only about 10,000 metric tons left. Nixon had 2 options. The first was to tighten policy, raise interest rates, cut spending, stop printing. That would have been painful. Unemployment would have spiked. His re-election chances would have cratered. The second option was to close the gold window, remove the constraint entirely, tell the world that the dollar was no longer redeemable for anything except trust in the United States government. He chose the second option. On the evening of August 15th, Nixon went on television and announced what he called a new economic policy. He framed it as protecting the American dollar. He said it was temporary. He said the average American would not even notice the difference. Think about what actually happened in that moment. The institution responsible for managing the most important currency on earth had just handed itself unlimited power. Before August 15th, there was a rule. You cannot create more money than you have gold. After August 15th, that rule was gone. The only limit on how much money the Federal Reserve could create was their own judgment. Does that sound familiar? A group of people, given authority without constraint, told to manage a system. And the only rule is, whatever they decide, the rules are. In the Stanford basement, it took 48 hours for the guards to start abusing their power. In the monetary system, it took a little longer, but the trajectory was identical. Before 1971, from the late 1940s through the early 70s, worker productivity and worker pay rose together almost in lockstep. If the economy got more productive, workers earned more. That relationship held for nearly 25 years. Then it snapped. After 1971, the money supply began expanding without limit, and something strange happened to ordinary workers. Productivity kept climbing. The American economy kept producing more output per hour of labor, but wages flatlined. According to the Economic Policy Institute, since the late 1970s, productivity has grown 8 times faster than typical worker compensation. The workers kept running on the treadmill, but the ground beneath them started moving backward. Where did all that productivity go? The same place the prisoner's dignity went in the Stanford experiment. It went to the people holding the power. Corporate profits soared. Executive compensation skyrocketed. Financial sector earnings ballooned. The The people closest to the money printer captured the gains. Everyone else got a paycheck that bought a little less every single year. Here's a number that should make your stomach drop. In 1971, the total national debt of the United States was about $400 billion. Today, it stands at over $38 trillion. That is not a typo, $38 trillion, growing at roughly $6 billion every single day. The government spent over $1.2 trillion last year just paying interest on that debt, not paying down the debt, just paying the interest. That number has nearly tripled in the past 5 years alone. This is what happens when you give an institution the ability to borrow without constraint for half a century. They do not moderate, they accelerate. In the prison experiment, the guards used fire extinguishers and solitary confinement. In the monetary experiment, the weapon was inflation, quiet, invisible, and devastatingly effective. You do not need to lock someone in a cell if you can slowly erode their ability to save, to buy a home, to retire. The result is the same. They stop resisting. They accept the situation. They comply. There is a moment in the Stanford experiment that researchers have studied for decades. It is not the moment the guards became cruel. It is the moment the prisoners stopped fighting back. On day 2, the prisoners staged their rebellion. They tore off their identification numbers, barricaded the doors, and shouted at the guards. It was chaotic. It was messy. But it was resistance. They were still acting like people who believed they had a choice. By day 4, that was over. The prisoners who remained were shuffling around with blank expressions. They followed orders without question. When the guards told them to do push-ups at 3 in the morning, they did push-ups at 3 in the morning. When a prisoner's mother came to visit and saw her son looking broken, the guards cleaned up the prison and coached the prisoners to say they were fine. And the prisoners said they were fine. They did not ask for help. They did not try to leave, even though they had the legal right to walk out at any time. They had been psychologically absorbed into the system. The prison was not just a physical space anymore. It was a mental framework. They had internalized their role as prisoners so completely that the idea of leaving simply stopped occurring to them. Now look at what has happened to the average worker in the 55 years since 1971. In 1971, a single income could buy a house, support a family, and put money into savings. That was normal. That was the expectation. Today, the national debt stands at $38.4 trillion and climbing at a rate of about $70,000 per second. The government paid over $1 trillion just in interest on that debt last year. Gold, which Nixon priced at $35 an ounce in 1971, is now trading above $5,000 an ounce. The dollar has lost over 98% of its purchasing power measured against gold since that August evening. And yet, what is the public reaction? Where is the rebellion? There is no rebellion. People complain about housing costs on social media and then go back to work. They watch the national debt clock tick past $38 trillion and shrug. They accept that a college degree costs 6 figures now. They accept that retirement might not happen until 70. They accept 2-income households as the baseline rather than the exception. This is not laziness. This is not stupidity. This is the exact same psychological process that happened in that Stanford basement. When you're inside a system long enough, the system stops feeling like a system. It just feels like reality. The prisoners did not think of themselves as people playing a role in a 2-week study. They thought of themselves as actual prisoners. And we do not think of ourselves as participants in a 55-year monetary experiment. We think this is just how the economy works. If you have been following this channel, you might remember the video on the 1968 behavioral sink experiment. John Calhoun built a paradise for mice. Unlimited food, unlimited water, no predators, no disease. And the mouse society collapsed anyway. The dominant males became violent, the females abandoned their young, and a group Calhoun called the beautiful ones withdrew completely. They stopped mating. They stopped socializing. They spent all day grooming themselves in isolation. They were physically healthy and psychologically destroyed. We are living through the human version of that experiment. The beautiful ones are the millions of people who have quietly dropped out. Not officially unemployed, but disengaged. Not protesting, but not participating either. Scrolling through screens in isolation. Physically present, but mentally checked out of a system that stopped working for them decades ago. In the Stanford experiment, a graduate student named Christina Maslach walked into the prison on day 5. She was the only outsider who saw what was happening. And she was horrified. She confronted Zimbardo directly and told him what he was doing was wrong. She was the only one out of 50 people who saw the experiment who raised an objection. One person out of 50. Sometimes I wonder how many people are walking through our economic system right now, seeing exactly what is happening and saying nothing, because the system tells us this is normal. The guards told the prisoners this was normal too. There's a detail in the Stanford experiment that people tend to overlook. The guards did not start with the worst tactics. They escalated. Day 1 was just uncomfortable. Day 2 was aggressive. By day 5, it was genuinely disturbing. The system did not jump to maximum oppression. It crept there. Each small escalation made the next one feel reasonable. That is exactly the pattern we should be watching right now. In 1971, the new guards of the monetary system needed one thing. They needed you to keep using dollars, even though those dollars were no longer backed by anything physical. And for 55 years, that has worked. Cash is anonymous. You can spend it wherever you want. Nobody tracks a $20 bill. The prison has walls, but the inmates still have some freedom of movement inside those walls. That is about to change. Right now, as of early 2026, 137 countries and currency unions representing 98% of global GDP are actively exploring central bank digital currencies. That is not a fringe idea. That is nearly the entire global economy. 49 countries have active pilot programs running. China already has over 2 billion digital wallets in circulation for their digital yuan. Russia plans to roll out the digital ruble to its largest banks by September of this year. Brazil is launching its CBDC called Drex in 2026. The European Central Bank is in a preparation phase for a digital euro. The Bank of England is designing the digital pound. A central bank digital currency is exactly what it sounds like. It is your money, issued directly by the central bank, existing only in digital form. Not in your mattress, not in a safe, on a server controlled by the same institution that already has unlimited authority to create it. And here is where the Stanford parallel becomes genuinely unsettling. In the experiment, the guards controlled the prisoners through a handful of crude tools: fire extinguishers, a dark closet, sleep deprivation, psychological pressure. It was brutal, but it was blunt. The prisoners could still whisper to each other through the walls. They could still refuse food. They had tiny pockets of resistance available to them. Now imagine a prison where the guards do not need fire extinguishers. Imagine a system where, if you dissent, your ability to buy groceries simply stops working. Your digital wallet gets frozen, not arrested, not charged with a crime, just frozen. Your access to your own money switched off by someone you will never meet, based on criteria you will never see. If you think that sounds extreme, it has already happened. In February 2022, the Canadian government invoked emergency powers during the trucker protests and froze the bank accounts of people who donated to the convoy. Not people who committed violence, people who sent $50 to a crowdfunding page. Their accounts were frozen without a court order. That was done within the existing banking system, which still has friction and intermediaries and legal processes that slow things down. A central bank digital currency removes all of that friction. The central bank does not need to call your bank and ask them to freeze your account. They are your bank. The transaction between you and authority becomes direct, instant, and total. In the Stanford experiment, when a prisoner went on a hunger strike, the guards threw him in the hole and told the other prisoners it was their fault. The punishment was visible. It was physical. Other prisoners could see it and understand it. In a CBDC system, the punishment is invisible. Your wallet just stops working. Nobody else even knows it happened. There is no solidarity because there is no shared experience of the punishment. Each prisoner is isolated in their own digital cell. This is the escalation pattern. 1971 gave the guards unlimited money creation. 2026 gives them unlimited money surveillance. The first removed the constraint on power. The second removes the constraint on enforcement. And if history teaches us anything, it is that unchecked power does not moderate itself. It accelerates. Think about the progression. In the 1970s, the government inflated quietly, and most people did not understand what was happening. In the 1980s and 1990s, financial deregulation concentrated wealth while wages stagnated, and most people blamed themselves for not keeping up. In 2008, the banks got bailed out with trillions of newly created dollars, and most people accepted it because they were told the alternative was worse. Each decade, the tools get more precise. Each decade, the public gets more conditioned to accept things that would have been unthinkable a generation earlier. A central bank digital currency is simply the next step in that progression, not a leap, a step. And that is what makes it so effective. It arrives not as a dramatic seizure of power, but as a convenient upgrade to the payment system. Zimbardo had to end his experiment after 6 days because it was spiraling out of control. Nobody is going to end the monetary experiment. There is no Christina Maslach walking into the Federal Reserve and pulling the plug. The experiment continues, and the tools get sharper. There is a question that haunts every discussion of the Stanford prison experiment. And it is the same question that should haunt every discussion about our current financial system. Why did the prisoners not just leave? They could have. Legally, at any time, a participant in the Stanford study could say the words, quote, "I quit the experiment," and they would have been released. That was in the consent form they signed. Zimbardo confirmed it. The door was never actually locked in a way that could not be opened. Almost nobody said those words. And the reason is something psychologists call learned helplessness. In 1967, 4 years before the Stanford experiment, a psychologist named Martin Seligman conducted a study where dogs were given small electric shocks. One group of dogs could stop the shocks by pressing a panel with their noses. Another group received shocks at random intervals with no way to stop them. Later, both groups were placed in a new environment where they could easily escape the shocks by jumping over a low barrier. The dogs who had previously been able to stop the shocks jumped the barrier immediately. The dogs who had experienced uncontrollable shocks just lay down. They whimpered. They took the pain. Even though the exit was right there, they did not move. They had learned that their actions did not matter. This is the psychological architecture of the post-1971 economy. For 55 years, working people have been receiving small, continuous economic shocks. Inflation eats your savings. Housing prices outpace your income. Tuition costs multiply faster than wages. You press the panel, you work harder, you get a second job, you cut expenses, and nothing changes. The shocks keep coming. The data is stark. Between 1948 and 1971, hourly compensation and net productivity grew at nearly identical rates, roughly 80 to 87% over that period. Workers pressed the panel, productivity went up, and they got paid more. The feedback loop worked. After 1971, productivity kept climbing, but compensation flatlined. By 2015, productivity had grown by 241% since 1948, while hourly compensation had grown by only 112%. The panel stopped working. But people kept pressing it, because what else were they going to do? Eventually, people stopped pressing the panel. They stopped believing their effort will produce a different outcome. They accept the situation, not because they agree with it, but because they have been conditioned to believe there is no alternative. In the Stanford experiment, prisoner 819 had a breakdown. He was sobbing. He was hyperventilating. He told the researchers he wanted to leave. But when the other prisoners began chanting, "Prisoner 819 is a bad prisoner," he asked to go back in. He wanted to go back into the environment that was destroying him because the social pressure of the system was stronger than his own survival instinct. Look at how many people know the financial system is broken and still participate in it as though nothing is wrong. They understand that holding cash loses value every year. They understand that the debt is unpayable. They understand that the game is rigged toward those closest to the money supply. And they keep playing because the entire social infrastructure around them tells them this is the only game that exists. Your employer pays you in dollars. Your landlord charges rent in dollars. Your government collects taxes in dollars. The entire apparatus of daily life is denominated in the currency that is being devalued. Opting out feels impossible, not because it is impossible, but because the system is designed to make you feel that way. That is not an accident. The Stanford guards figured out very quickly that the most effective form of control was not physical punishment. It was psychological. Make the prisoners internalize the rules. Make them police each other. Create a social structure where resistance itself feels like a violation of the norm. The fiat monetary system works the same way. If you suggest that holding cash might not be wise, people look at you like you have lost your mind. If you question whether the Federal Reserve acts in the public interest, you get labeled a conspiracy theorist. If you propose alternatives to the current system, you are dismissed as a crank. The prisoners guard each other. This is why Zimbardo said the Stanford experiment was not really about individual cruelty. It was about systems. It was about how a structure can take normal, healthy, well-adjusted people and reshape their behavior until they become either oppressors or compliant victims. Not because they chose those roles, but because the architecture of the system made those roles inevitable. The Stanford prison experiment was supposed to run for 14 days. It ended on day 6, and the way it ended tells you everything you need to know about how real-world prison systems, including monetary ones, eventually break. On the 5th night, Zimbardo invited his girlfriend at the time, Christina Maslach, to come observe the experiment. She was a recently minted psychology PhD. She walked into the hallway and watched as guards marched a line of prisoners, bags over their heads, chains on their ankles, shuffling toward the bathroom. She watched the other researchers standing around, observing, taking notes, treating the scene as perfectly normal academic work. And she turned to Zimbardo and said, "What you're doing to those boys is terrible." Zimbardo later admitted that she was the only person out of roughly 50 people who had seen the experiment who objected to what was happening. 50 people watched what was unfolding, and 49 of them accepted it as the way things were. One person saw it clearly enough to say, "This has to stop." That ratio should terrify you, not because people are bad, but because systems are powerful. When you are inside the system becomes your reality. You adapt to it, you normalize it, you lose the ability to see it from the outside. The financial system we have been living under since 1971 has had its own small moments where someone said, "This has to stop." Paul Volcker, who was in the room at Camp David when the gold window closed, later admitted he regretted the decision. In 2011, he said publicly that nobody was in charge of the international monetary system anymore. The architect of the system was telling you the building had no foundation. But the system kept going, because systems do not need your approval to continue. They need your participation. And as long as you're transacting in dollars, paying taxes in dollars, saving in dollars, you are participating. So how does the experiment actually end? The same way it ended at Stanford. Not because the guards decide to stop. They never decide to stop. Not because the prisoners organize a successful revolt. They are too broken for that. It ends because the system becomes so obviously dysfunctional that it can no longer sustain itself. In the Stanford experiment, the dysfunction became visible when prisoners started having psychological breakdowns that could not be hidden. The human cost became undeniable. In the monetary system, the dysfunction is becoming visible right now. The United States government is paying over $1 trillion a year just in interest on its debt. That number has nearly tripled in 5 years. The debt ceiling was raised by $5 trillion in July 2025, pushing the new limit to over $41 trillion. The Congressional Budget Office projects debt will exceed 120% of GDP within the decade. We are watching the system consume itself in real time. Gold is telling you the same story. At $35 an ounce in 1971, above $5,000 an ounce today. That is not gold going up. That is the dollar going down. Gold is the measuring stick that has not changed. It is the constant. Everything else has been distorted by 55 years of unchecked monetary creation. Central banks around the world know this, by the way. The People's Bank of China has been buying gold for 15 consecutive months. Central bank gold purchases globally have been at record levels for the past 3 years. The guards are quietly stacking gold while telling you the paper is fine. Pay attention to what they do, not what they say. Christina Maslach was not smarter than the other 49 people who observed the Stanford experiment. She was not more moral. She simply had one thing they did not. She was the only observer who was not already embedded in the system. Everyone else had spent days inside the experiment. They had gradually adapted to the escalating dysfunction until it seemed normal. She walked in fresh, saw the horror for what it was, and refused to accept it. Your ability to see the current system clearly depends on how deeply embedded you are within it. The further your wealth is tied to the dollar, the harder it is to see the dollar objectively. That is not a financial principle. That is a psychological one. And the Stanford experiment proved it 55 years ago. So where does this leave you? Let me be very direct, because I think directness matters more than ever right now. You are living inside a monetary experiment that started on August 15th, 1971. That experiment removed the only hard constraint on money creation. And since then, the system has behaved exactly the way the Stanford prison experiment predicted it would. The people with power have used that power to expand their control. The people without power have gradually adapted to diminishing conditions. And the tools of control are about to become significantly more sophisticated with the development of central bank digital currencies across the globe. The Stanford experiment ended when Christina Maslach saw the situation for what it was and said, "Enough. The monetary experiment will end when enough people do the same thing, not through protest, not through political action, through the simplest and most powerful act available to you, choosing to hold something that cannot be printed." Gold was $35 an ounce in 1971. It is above $5,000 today. That is not speculation. That is not a bubble. That is 55 years of monetary debasement measured against the one asset that central banks cannot create out of thin air. And they know it, which is why they keep buying it themselves. Physical precious metals, real tangible assets, these are the things that exist outside the prison walls. They are not controlled by the guards. They are not denominated in a currency that someone else can debase at will. They are not digital entries on a server that can be frozen with a keystroke. They are yours in your hand, and no algorithm can take them away. I am not telling you to panic. I'm telling you to pay attention. The 1971 experiment has been running for 55 years, and every measurable indicator says we are in the late stages. The national debt is growing at $70,000 per second. Interest payments alone crossed $1 trillion last year. 137 countries are building the infrastructure for digital money that will give the central banks direct control over how you spend, save, and transact. Zimbardo ended the Stanford experiment because he finally saw what it was doing to real people. But he only saw it because someone outside the system forced him to look. I'm asking you to be that person for yourself. Step outside the system mentally, even if you cannot step outside it financially all at once. Start seeing the architecture for what it is. You know what the most chilling detail of the Stanford experiment is? It is not the cruelty of the guards. It is not the breakdowns of the prisoners. It is what happened afterward. When the experiment ended and the students went home, most of the guards said they were surprised at their own behavior. They did not understand how they had become what they became. And most of the prisoners said they were surprised too. They could not explain why they did not just leave. The system made them. The structure made them. The architecture made them. And nobody saw it clearly until it was over. You do not have to wait until it is over to see it clearly. You are seeing it right now. There is a trilogy of experiments that define the psychological underpinnings of the modern world. In 1967, Martin Seligman showed that suffering without agency creates learned helplessness. In 1968, John Calhoun showed that abundance without purpose creates societal collapse. And in 1971, Philip Zimbardo showed that power without constraint creates tyranny. Helplessness, collapse, tyranny. That is not just a series of psychology studies, that is a roadmap. And the 1971 monetary experiment combined all three into one system that we have been living inside ever since. Think about where we are standing. The learned helplessness has been engineered through 5 decades of declining purchasing power that no amount of individual effort can overcome. The behavioral sink is visible in collapsing birth rates, rising rates of isolation, and a generation that is quietly checked out of institutions their parents trusted. And the tyranny is being upgraded from analog to digital. From inflation, you cannot see, to surveillance, you cannot escape. Each piece reinforces the others. You cannot fight the tyranny because you are helpless. You cannot organize resistance because the social fabric has collapsed. And the collapse accelerates because the tyrants face no constraint. The experiment is ending, not because someone is choosing to end it, but because the math no longer works. The debt is too large, the interest payments are too high, the currency has been stretched too far. Something has to give, and historically, what gives is the purchasing power of the people at the bottom of the system. Do not be in the cell when they lock the door. If this connected something for you, share it with somebody who needs to hear it. I will see you in the next one.